You're listening to People, Places, Planet, the official podcast of the Environmental Law Institute, a nonpartisan, nonprofit research and education institute making law work for people, places, and the planet. If you enjoy the podcast and want to support our work, consider donating at eli.org/donate.
Welcome, listeners, to another episode of People, Places, Planet. I'm your host, Sebastian Duque Rios. In today's episode, we'll be diving into the tools that are available to local governments for wetland protection. And we couldn't think of a better time to have this conversation. May is American Wetlands Month, a reminder that these critical ecosystems deserve not just our appreciation, but our active protection. Whether you work in land use planning, watershed management, government, or conservation, you've probably felt the reverberations of the Sackett Supreme Court decision, a ruling that stripped back federal Clean Water Act protections for wetlands. So who's stepping up to fill that gap? Local governments. And today, we're going to show you how they're doing it, what tools are available to them, and what's actually working on the ground. For this, we have 3 conversations lined up for you. First up, Amy Reed, Senior Attorney at the Environmental Law Institute, will talk us through ELI's newly published Local Wetlands Protection Playbook, a practical, field-ready resource for local governments and community leaders navigating the post-Sackett world. Then, Karen Capiella from the Center for Watershed Protection joins us to talk about Bluffton, South Carolina, and what other communities can learn from their experience. And finally, we'll hear from Mahtab Bagherzadeh and Nina Struess from the National Wildlife Federation and Prairie Rivers Network about wetland conservation work underway in the Quad Cities region of Iowa and Illinois. Joining us first is ELI Senior Attorney Amy Reed. Welcome to the podcast, Amy. Good to have you.
Thanks for having me.
Would you want to maybe take a second to introduce yourself and a little bit of what you work on at ELI?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, I'm a senior attorney at ELI. I've been at ELI for over 10 years now, and for the past several years, I've been spending most of my time working on projects that look to advance nature-based solutions to water quality and water management challenges.
Fantastic. Well, it's great to have you today. It's always fun to do an episode with a colleague. And before we dive into discussing ELI's playbook and dive into some of the policies and tools that are discussed in it, let's take a step back. Why do wetlands matter ecologically, economically, and for community resilience? And what are some of the most immediate threats that wetlands are facing today?
Wetlands are important for so many reasons, and they're out there quietly providing us not just the natural world, but the human world with so many different services. Because they're the transitional zone between land and water, wetlands have a unique position in the landscape, and many types of wetlands are some of the most productive ecosystems on Earth. Most people probably already know that they sustain plant and animal habitats and ecosystems, but what is less well understood or less commonly known is how many tangible benefits they can provide to human communities. Wetlands act like natural sponges that store, slow down, and filter water. So that means when it rains or snows, they're storing that stormwater and slowing down its flow into the nearest water conveyance, whether that's a natural stream or a man-made sewer pipe or ditch. That means that the peak flows of the stormwater are going to be lower, making it less likely that the water will at some point exceed the capacity of the pipe or the river and lead to flooding. At the watershed level, this means reduced erosion along rivers and streams caused by storms. But it also benefits the local hard infrastructure that we put in place to manage water, meaning it's less likely that you'll see an event like a combined sewer system overflow. But even at the individual property level, having a wetland nearby might be the difference between some patches of flooding in your backyard and water coming in through your foundation. Another thing that sponge function does is filter out pollutants. In agricultural areas, having a wetland at the edge of the field can filter out over half the nitrates from the draining water before the nearest ditch or stream. In developed areas, wetlands can reduce the need for and the cost of water treatment infrastructure. New York City's famously clean water is because wetlands and other forest ecosystems are doing that filtration work in the upstate watersheds. And speaking of drinking water supply, wetlands have an important connection to the health of our groundwater aquifers, and that those sponges keep the water from flowing out of the recharge area, giving it time to drain back into the aquifer instead. And the improved hydrology and water quality that we see from wetlands also supports healthier fisheries, which can increase local tourism revenue. In some places, wetlands are serving as habitat for game species like ducks and deer, in addition, of course, to native species and threatened and endangered species. And then coastal wetlands are helping buffer coastal communities from the impacts of storm surge. So in addition to those benefits that feel more intangible, like habitat value and the mental health benefits of open space and recreation, there are real measurable economic benefits associated with conserving and restoring wetlands. I like to say that when wetlands are lost, all those services that they provided now have to be paid for in other ways. So that's by your downstream neighbors, by taxpayers, by utilities, consumers, farmers, insurers, and ultimately by the next generation. You had asked about the most immediate threat to wetlands today, and that probably depends on the type of wetlands we're talking about. For coastal wetlands, sea level rise means that the coastal wetlands will either be swallowed by the ocean or migrate inland. And there are lots of places where we have built our houses, roads, and other infrastructure along the shoreline that will keep them from migrating. For wetland types like playa wetlands and prairie potholes, sedimentation is a big issue because soil erodes from adjacent croplands and washes into the little basin that holds the water, reducing that sponge capacity and clogging the drainage back to the aquifer. Urban wetlands are among the most stressed ecosystems in the country because their proximity to dense human activity and development makes them vulnerable to being filled and polluted in lots of different ways. But if I had to choose one word to describe the biggest threat, I'd probably just say human development. The US has lost over half of its wetlands since European settlement.
And so ELI recently published a local wetland protection playbook, which lays out strategies for local governments, landowners, and community advocates to better protect wetlands. Could you give us a brief overview of this playbook and what inspired its development?
Yeah, so the concept for the playbook originated around 3 years ago, right around the time of the Sackett decision. We didn't know then exactly what the federal regulatory landscape would look like moving forward, but we knew that state and local governments in any scenario were going to have a more important role to play. Most of our wetland program work in the past is focused on state programs, and we have lots of resources on our website related to those, some of which we've updated since the Sackett decision. But we also wanted to try coming at it from a different angle and to be able to consider strategies and tools that felt perhaps more realistic and achievable in the shorter term than widespread state legislative efforts. We were thinking of places like South Carolina, where your next guests come from, where the state legislature is very much not open to increasing protections using regulatory programs. But there are communities that might feel like actually something needs to be done here. We suspected that many local governments have more tools available to them than they even realize. Then, with the change in federal administration coming on the heels of Sackett and one of the worst case scenarios, frankly, playing out with respect to the regulatory changes, we realized that more and more of our colleagues and partners across the country were starting to think much more seriously about protecting wetlands at the local level. So we wanted to help those folks get oriented in the world of local approaches, which can feel overwhelming when you take an expansive view of what it means to advance wetland protection, which is what I think we all need to be doing.
And so you just mentioned, I think, a looming decision that really has had a huge impact on the wetland space, Sackett, which narrowed federal protections under the Clean Water Act. So what protections for wetlands still exist at the federal level, and what are the biggest gaps now?
Right. So for listeners who may not be familiar, the Sackett decision was a big deal because it changed the decades-long definition of waters of the United States, which I'm going to call WOTUS. I mean, that's the statutory phrase that defines the geographic scope of federal jurisdiction under the Clean Water Act. WOTUS status is what determines which waters are protected by federal regulatory programs like the NIPD's permitting system for pollutant discharges and the Section 404 dredge and fill program for activities in waters and wetlands. The Clean Water Act can only regulate WOTUS because Congress's authority to regulate this stuff is linked to its authority to regulate interstate commerce. And so the idea is that navigable waters are part of the interstate commerce system. And since the Clean Water Act was enacted, the concept of what WOTUS means evolved to include not only water that you could, in fact, navigate, in a kayak or a traditional canoe, but also certain tributaries and adjacent wetlands that are deemed sufficiently connected to those obviously navigable waters. And that question of what it means to be sufficiently connected has been the subject of many headaches and much litigation in the 50 plus years since the Clean Water Act was passed. And I will spare you the long version, but by the 2000s, a case called Rapanos left us with what was called the significant nexus test. Under that test, wetlands or tributaries fall under the Clean Water Act if they significantly affect the chemical, physical, or biological integrity of a downstream navigable water. This test embraced the idea of a connection that's based on hydrological and biological function, not the continuous presence or absence of visible surface water, because that's just not how the hydrological science works. And then in 2023, the Supreme Court took the issue up again in the Sackett case, and they categorically rejected that significant nexus test. Now, after Sackett, in order to be WOTUS, waters have to be navigable, or they have to be, quote, relatively permanent bodies of water or wetlands that are connected to the navigable waters via a, quote, continuous surface connection. After the federal administration changed in 2025, EPA and the Corps rewrote their rules to add definitions for relatively permanent and continuous surface connections that are pretty restrictive. And the definitions that we saw in the proposed rule will lead to a situation where the majority of our remaining freshwater wetlands are now more vulnerable to development because they've lost those Clean Water Act protections.
Thank you, Amy. And you mentioned that part of the inspiration for this playbook was the suspicion that many local governments have more tools available to them than they realize, right? So what is the role that state and local governments now play in wetland protection?
After Sackett, states have to decide whether and how to keep up with this shifting federal coverage by adopting and implementing protections for waters that are no longer protected by federal law. Around half of the states already have an independent state-level regulatory program for wetlands, but the other half rely on the federal WOTUS definition and federal authority for coverage of their dredge and fill programs and other Clean Water Act regulatory programs. And while there may be some states where the legislature is willing now to expand coverage to help fill those gaps after Sackett, the truth is there are many states where that isn't going to happen anytime soon. And in those situations, it's more important than ever for local governments to step into a leadership role. Local governments know their lands and they're familiar with their critical role as primary regulators of land use and development. They also know their waters and wetlands. And so between their authority to plan and regulate land use and the many non-regulatory tools and incentives that are available to them and their constituents, local governments really have a substantial opportunity to promote wetland protection in their communities.
Great. And so what are some of the most effective tools or mechanisms that are available to local governments?
That's a hard question, but I'm actually glad that you asked it that way because it gives me an opening to explain that these strategies and tools are far from one size fits all. Actually, part of the purpose of the playbook is to not only identify this wide-ranging menu of strategies and tools, but to provide context around them and examples of how they're being used in real life so that the reader can determine which of these tools might be the most appropriate and feasible in their particular situation. In general, we've organized the options into three core buckets, which we call pathways, that correspond to the three sections of the playbook. First is local land use planning, using both non-binding plans and regulatory instruments. The second part leans into the idea of letting landowners lead through voluntary conservation measures, which they take in exchange for federal and state incentives, and how communities can help scale up the local uptake of these programs. The third section leans into the idea of leading by example, that local governments who think wetland protection is valuable can put their money where their mouth is and start with the properties and processes that they do have control over. And that last section gets into not only ideas for demonstration and pilot projects, but it's also where we highlight the concept of using a wetland prioritization system to get the most bog for your buck, and where there's some guidance around bridging the funding gaps that would otherwise be an obstacle to going for like a federally funded project that has multiple benefits for your community. You can imagine a situation where you would like to use green infrastructure for stormwater infrastructure that can also serve as a park or a civic space where the federal money isn't allowed to pay for that playground equipment or the amphitheater. But those features are actually how the local government is going to get the buy-in from the community in the first place. And so the playbook provides some tips and strategies for helping to close those gaps. And because it's a wide-ranging sampler menu, the playbook alone is not going to get a local government all the way on any of the strategies and tools that we cover. It's really meant to be enough information to evaluate whether this might be right for you, to start conversations, and to inspire further research. So there's not one answer for everyone about what's most effective, but I'm looking forward to hearing from Bluffton and the Quad Cities on what they found to be most effective for that.
Thank you, Amy, for that comprehensive overview of the legal landscape and the important role that the Wetlands Protection Playbook can play at this critical inflection point for local wetland governance post-Sackett. It's really been a pleasure having this discussion with you. And for the rest of the episode, we're going to put that framework into practice with two case studies. First up, let's hear more about Bluffton, South Carolina, a great example of what local action actually looks like. Joining us is Karen Capiella, Director of Research at the Center for Watershed Protection. She began her career as a GIS professional and has spent 26 years at CWP leading applied watershed research projects, developing watershed plans, and translating research into practical guidance for communities. She recently assisted the town of Bluffton with their wetland ordinance and updated wetland mapping. Welcome to the podcast, Karen. It's great to have you.
Thanks, Sebastian.
Well, let's start off by talking a little about ELI's playbook. So the first section focuses on leveraging local planning efforts. From your expertise, Karen, what role does zoning play, and what are some of the zoning approaches or policies that have proven to be effective?
So For local governments that want to protect their wetlands locally, there's a couple of key decisions about what they would want to include in a wetland ordinance and different options. So one thing would be defining what they mean by a wetland. So that kind of governs like what kinds of wetlands are subject to the ordinance. And in the town of Bluffton's case, they specifically defined jurisdictional and non-jurisdictional wetlands. So it doesn't matter, whatever the Corps has determined, it's still covered under the town's ordinance. And then one of the most common ways to protect wetlands is to require a vegetated buffer around the wetland. And communities can choose different widths, and often they'll set variable widths depending on different wetland types or different goals. For example, if their goal is to protect specific habitat types, they might have a much wider buffer than if they're just trying to protect wetlands from a water quality perspective. And then generally, you're going to want to outline what sort of activities are prohibited within that buffer and within the wetland and what's allowed. And then you're going to want to have like a structure for what's the application and review process. Are there any exemptions? Are there waivers? How is it going to be enforced? And those sorts of things.
Can you walk us through what it is exactly that Bluffton achieved? So in other words, if you can just tell us a little bit more about that 50-foot buffer policy requirement that Bluffton is working on.
Sure. So the wetland buffer is a setback between the edge of the wetland and any adjacent disturbance or structures that are part of development. It's a way to protect wetlands from the impacts of development, whether it's increased runoff or pollution being discharged to the wetland. It's actually still in the process of being adopted, but they've implemented a wetland protection ordinance. They've been doing it in phases over about the past 3 years. The first phase included adopting a 25-foot wetland buffer in 2024. And they did this through amending their Unified Development Ordinance. And so the town's goal was to just get some wetland protections in place quickly while they were in the process of researching additional modifications based on the science behind wetland buffers and also with looking at examples from other communities. And then the next phase, which started around 2025, they've been working on expanding wetland protection by increasing the buffer width to 50 feet and then also creating an updated map of wetlands within the town. So previously, they relied on the National Wetland Inventory, which we know is outdated in many regions. Certain wetland types, especially very small wetlands, can be underrepresented. So right now, they're working on additional modifications to further clarify the ordinance and better align it with those mapping tools.
Fantastic. And was this policy requirement more of a top-down initiative, or was it something that was driven by community advocacy?
It was really more of a top-down approach. The town had strong support from a couple of town council members and also from the mayor, Larry Toomer. And then they also, at the time that they started this work back in 2023, this was after the Sackett ruling, but part of the motivation for the wetland ordinance came from a couple of studies that they were working on that pointed to the importance of providing regulatory protection from development encroachment as a way to increase flood resilience. So one of the studies was a resilience planning analysis for the town, and then they also did a drainage analysis for one of Bluffton's watersheds. And both studies highlighted the benefit of additional policy protection for wetlands, which we know store floodwaters, as well as for areas that may be subject to flooding in the future. And so for the study watershed, they modeled which areas may be subject to future flooding by taking into account sea level rise and precipitation changes.
I'm wondering, for listeners from other towns or cities who might be curious about this research that led to this policymaking process, how did that research come about? Was it done in partnership with a state agency, or what led to that research to begin with?
I'm not sure what the impetus for the research was. The resilience study was conducted by the College of Charleston Low Country Hazard Center and then the South Carolina Sea Grant Consortium. And I guess the town commissioned those agencies to do the analysis. And the goal of that was to look at how vulnerable different town assets and infrastructure were to flooding, both now and in the future. And then also look at potential policy mechanisms to strengthen resilience. And then the other study, there was a consulting firm that they hired to conduct the drainage study, and it was for the Hayward Cove Basin. And their goal is to do the same drainage analysis for all of the town's watersheds, but right now they just have the Hayward Cove one, and they've been kind of using that information to inform the development of resiliency zoning, I think is what they're calling it. but they have a consulting firm, McCormick Taylor, that's working on that part for them. And they're basically identifying these areas that may be inundated in the future, and they're calling them resiliency zones. And then the goal is to modify their development ordinances to have some kind of restrictions in those areas to protect people from future flooding. So things like elevation-based zoning, I think, is one thing that they're looking at doing. So below a certain base flood elevation that's projected out into the future, you wouldn't be allowed to have like residential structures, or only certain uses would be allowed under there, and they would have to meet certain conditions like flood proofing.
Thank you, Karen. I think the context of how all this information is being collected and driven is going to be interesting for some of our listeners who maybe work in other towns or cities that are interested in leveraging some of their local planning efforts towards protecting their local wetlands in a post-Sackett world, right? And all of that starts with the evidence that can help drive some of this evidence-based decision making. And so my next question is, what impacts have these policies had so far in the town of Bluffton?
So, like I said, the ordinance is not finalized, so it's a little early to quantify kind of impacts, but it has been significant in that the wetland protection regulations apply to all projects requiring a stormwater permit, and it gives the town the direct authority to protect wetlands within their boundaries, regardless of jurisdictional determination. So that's the really significant part of it. And Bluffton is the first local government in the state of South Carolina to address the loopholes created by the Sackett decision. The other part that's interesting is the updated mapping that they asked for to go along with the ordinance. That mapping identified more than 3,000 additional acres of potential wetlands. So these are wetlands that weren't shown in the National Wetlands Inventory. And that updated map provides a tool for staff to help determine if a proposed development may impact a wetland during the development review process. So it's kind of like you can't protect it if you don't know that it's there. So having that updated mapping is a helpful tool for them.
Fantastic. And what lessons can other communities take from Bluffton's experience as the first town in South Carolina to take advantage of the opportunities, and especially other towns who are interested in leveraging other forms of local planning efforts?
Well, we actually asked the town this question because we interviewed them we highlighted this work in a case study of our own. And they mentioned a couple of important things. One was partnerships. So they had 2 partnerships early on with organizations that helped them by providing legal expertise and resources. So the South Carolina Environmental Law Project, they had a model ordinance that the town was able to use and adapt for their purposes. And then the Southern Environmental Law Center, I think both organizations provided access to legal expertise that wouldn't have been available otherwise, and donated their time to help them. So that saved them time and money. And they initially made these connections just through other communities that they reached out to and had connections with that were doing resilience work. So I think the advice there is just to explore similar partnership opportunities in your region. And then the other thing that they mentioned too is that in dealing with the public, that it's just really important to let the public know what's being changed and why in order to get their support, and then to share information early so that staff can address any concerns before they get too far along in the process. And then I guess another thing too is that Bluffton's in South Carolina, but we know each state is a little bit different in terms of what authority municipalities have to adopt local ordinances and regulate land use. So having that legal expertise was helpful to them because they got advised on, what would be the best approach for them, but a community in a different state may have a very different situation. So seeking legal advice is important, as the town did.
I do think that's some really good advice, right? Like seeking partnerships that will facilitate legal expertise, but particularly seeking legal partnerships with organizations that understand your local context and that will be able to help you, say, adapt a model ordinance per se into the legal context that you find yourself in your state. So that's really valuable advice.
One other thing I could add is that the town also, instead of completely starting from scratch, they did look into any other similar ordinances from communities within South Carolina or just in the region. I don't think there were too many in the state, but they were able to meet with some of those communities and draw some lessons learned from them so that they weren't, having to just completely create this from scratch themselves. So looking at what other similar communities are doing is important.
So to close us out, Karen, I wanted to ask you, how can local governments or individuals help to protect wetlands? What are some strategies or steps that can be taken to advance this goal?
So we primarily support local governments, and I think like Bluffton did, local governments across the country can take action to fill in the gaps in state and local wetland protection by adopting updated regulations and creating updated wetland maps. So I guess the first piece of advice I would have is just talk to your state wetland agencies to find out if they're already planning any sort of regulatory changes to help fill the gaps, or if they're working on updated statewide wetland maps, because they may already be doing that. But if not, I think, like we talked about before, seeking legal advice to kind of see what your different options are as far as how to incorporate wetland protection into your existing ordinances, looking at what other communities are doing. And then for the mapping, there's a couple different methods, and it really depends on what data sets are available for your region. But in Bluffton, we did a combination of two different kinds of analyses. We did an overlay analysis of several different layers that are typically indicative of wetlands, like low points in the landscape, soil wetness, hydric soils. And then there's another method that's called machine learning. And if you have enough data, you can sort of train a computer to make a guess at where wetlands are based on data that reflects known locations that are or are not wetlands. So basically, you can teach it to use the spatial data to identify where wetlands may be located. And we didn't have enough data in Bluffton to do that, but we did a statistical analysis that began to get there. So it was kind of a combination of the overlay analysis and then statistical analysis to identify what the town is calling potential wetlands. So they use that, or will be using that, when they get site plan applications to take a look and see, are there any potential wetlands on the site where we need to have a wetland delineation conducted, and what are the potential impacts?
Thank you, Karen, for walking us through Bluffton's experience. Truly a model for how evidence-based policy, strategic legal partnerships, and a phased approach can help a community get real wetland protections in place, even when the state legislature isn't ready to act. What you heard from Bluffton was primarily a story about regulatory tools, zoning, buffers, and updated mapping. Our next guests are working in the Quad Cities region, a bi-state metro straddling the Mississippi River in Iowa and Illinois, where a coalition of NGOs, municipalities, and community members are taking a regional, data-driven approach to nature-based solutions. Joining us next, we have Mahtab Bagherzadeh and Nina Struess. Mahtab is a conservation professional with a decade of experience in watershed management, agricultural conservation, and program management. She currently serves as the Senior Program Manager for the Mississippi River Program at the National Wildlife Federation. In this role, Mahtab manages a portfolio of projects and work groups along the main stem of the Mississippi River, working with a broad coalition of partners and affiliates to create a healthy, more resilient river for the wildlife and people who depend on it. She joined the Federation in 2022 following her role as a River Basin Coordinator for Kentucky's Non-Point Source program. Mahtab holds a BS in Biology with a minor in Crop and Soil Sciences from Virginia Tech and an MS in Soil Ecology from the University of Kentucky. Nina Struess joined Prairie Rivers Network in 2023 as the River Health and Resiliency co-organizer and actively works to advance nature-based solutions specific to river health in the Quad Cities region. In collaboration with the National Wildlife Federation, she educates, engages, and activates the public and community leaders about the benefits of natural river, wetland, and floodplain functions and their impacts on the Quad Cities. She's an active environmental partner through involvement with organizations like the Clean River Advisory Council and the Bi-State Conservation Action Network. With a background in nutrition as a registered dietitian, Nina has spent much of her career focusing on improving the overall health and wellness of the Quad Cities community. Welcome both to the podcast. It's great to have you here with me today.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for having us.
The second section of ELI's playbook shifts the focus from top-down regulation to something a little different, meeting landowners and communities where they are, and making the case for wetland conservation in terms that matter to them. From your work in the Quad Cities, what does that look like in practice? What are the best approaches for communicating the value of wetlands to landowners? And where do NGOs and community groups fit into that picture? Nina, maybe we can start with you.
That's a really important question. And especially when it comes to landowners, everybody might have a different opinion or outlook on the benefits of wetlands. But at the end of the day, when you could communicate with a landowner about what they care about, most landowners care about the long-term productivity, sustainability of their land, especially if they're farmers. They care about their bottom line. And so when we look at wetlands from that perspective, they're incredibly beneficial in reducing flooding, especially on adjacent farmlands. They help filter runoff. They can even support recreational opportunities, which is important. Things like hunting and fishing. And so these are all really concrete economic and quality of life benefits. And so that can be really helpful. And really, when you incorporate the NGOs, I often think the NGOs are kind of the connective tissue, right? They make everything else work. And especially when you're looking at landowners, they're often the ones that can get the story across better than, for instance, like our organization. So a great example would be working with, if we're talking about farmers, for instance, a local NRCS office for here. A great example would be the Rock Island County Soil and Water Conservation District. There are employees there who have great long-standing relationships with a lot of these landowners who could be able to provide these conversations in a way, in a context that is much more relatable, and also fostering those opportunities for connection to neighbors who have had success stories, have understand the benefits as well. That's going to be way better than, and probably more successful than, providing a brochure or a handout about the benefits. It's that feet on the ground, the boots on the ground, the connection there. And so really, again, it's those NGOs. They're the ones that are building the public will. They're building the community trust. And that really helps make that buy-in more voluntary in the long run.
That was beautifully said, Nina. I'll answer the second part of that question about the role NGOs can play. And just like Nina said, being that connective tissue is a role that we have found ourselves fulfilling. And I think we approach conservation as some kind of puzzle. And we are not only putting the puzzle together, but we are assembling all the different pieces and being that convener and facilitator and helping communities. For example, in the Rock Island community where Nina and NWF have been working on the Rock Island Wetlands project, this is a great example of a local community who was excited and really motivated to protect this natural asset. And NWF and PRN entered the space supporting those local interests and providing those connections, developing options for the city, and helping the city take this path of least resistance by doing all this due diligence and research and time that their staff might not have the capacity to do, so that we can bring all these options and show them the path forward. And ultimately, that's exactly what happened. Through our connections and through local voices, we were able to connect all these pieces together and create, hopefully, what will be this conservation easement that'll protect this area in perpetuity. The other thing that I wanted to say, I live in central Kentucky, and something that we've noticed here and elsewhere or across the country is that sometimes it's not for lack of interest that a local government or, any entity might not pursue nature-based solutions. They might not have the staffing, they might not have the technical resources. There might not be an engineer or some construction company that could even do these kinds of practices. And so the role that NGOs can really help support, in addition to that facilitating and convening all the pieces and partners, is helping advocate to make sure that we have adequate funding and resources and policies that can support the work on the ground. I have a background in science, and I've always said, we could do all the science that we want, but if we don't have the policies that support that, then it's really not going to have that much of an impact at the end of the day.
I'm really excited to hear about some of this ongoing work in the Quad Cities region. So could you start by just giving us a brief overview of some of the work that you've been leading in the region?
Sure. We started a lot of this work in April of 2024 with the release of our Quad Cities specific climate assessment. And so this assessment provides climate models that project how flooding and droughts and extreme heat could potentially affect the Quad Cities region from now all the way through the end of the century. And this is actually really the driving force of our work here in the Quad Cities. We translate these projections into actionable options, and a lot of this is done through ongoing community engagement around nature-based solutions and helping to identify ways that the Quad Cities can really prepare for and adapt to these coming changes. And so it shows up in different ways, and it has throughout the last couple of years. We have some educational tools that have been really impactful for the community. We developed an interactive flood map that was a resource that was specifically requested from the stakeholders in the Quad Cities. That's been pretty imperative, as well as a educational video that talks a little bit about some basic nature-based solutions and really kind of helps general public understand a little bit more about what they are, which ones are here in the Quad Cities, and why they're incredibly important to advocate and protect. And then we have some current projects that we're looking at. We're just released a report on our ecological corridor network that's starting to drive a little bit more of our work now, and are also starting to really dip our toes into the planning space. We're looking at how we can integrate nature-based solution projects and language into local hazard mitigation plans to really emphasize the necessity and optimize funding potential for these projects here in the Quad Cities region.
I think some of our listeners probably aren't familiar with what the Quad Cities are. I know I wasn't before I started developing some of the questions for the episode. So before we go into this next question, would you just want to tell us a little bit about the region and where is it located? What communities does it include?
Yeah, I'd love to. I've called the Quad Cities home for most of my life. And the best visual I can give people is if you're looking on a map and you know where Illinois and Iowa join, that little dip where the Mississippi River runs east to west. That's really where a majority of the region sits. Fun fact, we're not 4 cities. We're actually 5 main cities. We have 2 on the Iowa side, Davenport and Bettendorf, and then Rock Island, Moline, and East Moline reside on the Illinois side. But if you asked most of us who have lived here and called the Quad Cities home, it really extends even further than that. We have probably at least 14 to 15 cities that really call the Quad Cities home. So we're really unique in that we are a bi-state region. So we have people that live in Illinois and work in Iowa, live in Iowa and work in Illinois, go to their favorite restaurants in Iowa, even though they live in Illinois. So there's a lot of rivers crossing the several bridges that we have that connect us. We are connected by that Mississippi River, but also the Rock River. And so we are uniquely positioned for a lot of these different climate changes that we're experiencing, specifically flooding. Flooding is something that we are very familiar with and have, for the most part, a very good handle on here, depending on the side of the river. And yeah, it's a great place to live.
It's always just nice to hear when talking about case studies to get a picture of what is the place in the communities that we're talking about a little bit. And especially when it comes to something like wetlands that are so intricately linked to this river that it is really a force of life for the region. But to your point about the Quad Cities region spanning 2 states and several jurisdictions, how do you navigate coordination across these political boundaries when it comes to these issues?
Yeah, it's a unique process. I would say, though, really collaboration is key. Aligning with partners on both sides of the river who have similar goals tends to really spur the best outcomes. We also are uniquely positioned in that we have a few organizations whose sole purpose really is to help bridge the divide on both sides of the river. And that's been incredibly important in the planning space, especially. There are obviously political issues that are different depending on whether you live in Illinois or Iowa. But what I think is really interesting is that those are on the state level when you really get more hyper localized. Quad Cityans tend to not see those issues as just an Iowa issue or just an Illinois specific issue, especially when it comes to ecological issues. A really great example is the Rock Island Wetlands. This area brought people from all over in support. And what is a city of Rock Island specific issue has activated people from other cities, including Iowa. And those people also regularly attend meetings that are specific to its protection. So When we look at it in that hyperlocal sense, it's just a river that divides us, not necessarily anything further. And if you ask most people who live here in the Quad Cities, especially from the environmental standpoint, we are trying as much as possible to collaborate and align. So that way we are looking at things from a regional aspect instead of just always city or state specific.
As you also mentioned earlier, there's been a lot of work that's been done using data and climate assessments. So how have these tools helped shape conversations with local governments or shift priorities in the area?
We're seeing extreme weather becoming a stronger driver for decision makers and policymakers, in addition to other sectors like the economy. We're also seeing local governments taking on more responsibility for preparing for and responding to natural disasters. And so our tools are designed to help municipalities answer two really important questions. One, what is at risk? And two, how do we prioritize action? The local data that we've provided in this climate assessment shows specifically in the Quad Cities how future events like flooding can impact communities. And that has really helped shift the conversation and shift priorities towards thinking about understanding how these future impacts can affect the Quad Cities. And oftentimes we don't always have that kind of data available to a community or localized to a region. And that can be a big barrier to planning. Or maybe we do have that kind of data, but it's fragmented across state lines, for example, in this region, or it's fragmented across state agencies or other jurisdictions. And that can be another really big barrier. So we're trying to shape these conversations by minimizing the random acts of restoration, really trying to avoid city by city action in response to these events that really impact the entire Quad Cities. And so it's through this collective action that we're trying to have a larger impact.
And the recognition of this ecological corridor that your team identified is perhaps an effort to get at this potential for collaborative and collective action. So what does that ecological corridor across the region look like in practice, and how can it help to guide decision making?
Yeah, it's a really great tool we developed in partnership with the University of Illinois Discovering Partners Institute. What it does is it takes data from the climate assessments, these local climate projections. It also prioritizes natural streams, wetlands, floodplains as these high priority areas for conservation. And then what it does is it looks at the watershed scale. So it looks at how water actually moves across the landscape versus across artificial political lines. And then what it does is it takes all of that, along with other data sets, and it identifies these unprotected areas of land that if they were conserved, they would give us the biggest return for flood risk reduction, wildlife habitat benefits, water quality improvements, in addition to community benefits like outdoor recreation. What that looks like in practice could look like many different things. And city governments can choose different levels of entry. So, for example, a lower effort intervention would be taking this ecological corridor as a data layer and integrating it into their comprehensive planning or a hazard mitigation plan. And they could use these natural areas that have been identified and either use them in comprehensive planning to say, hey, there are these areas within our jurisdiction that are critical for reducing our flood risk. We want to preserve this as an open space. Maybe they want to take it a step further, and instead of having just a designation, maybe they want to put some kind of protection, like an easement on that, and really lock in those benefits for a matter of time or in perpetuity. They can also guide capital planning and investments for a community. And then these higher level interventions, not as a higher level, but maybe higher effort interventions might include developing or modifying policies and ordinances, changing city code and zoning that reflect the ecological corridor. An example might be a city could change an ordinance or construction code to say, if you're going to have development that intersects with this ecological corridor, then you have to have some kind of a buffer of X feet, for example, in order to help protect that natural flood function that these spaces provide. our bigger vision here is to connect local projects and policies to this broader regional framework that really extends past these political lines and jurisdictions and creates a more resilient Quad Cities. And we really want the cities to be working together and thinking about how they can either support mutually beneficial projects or working upstream and downstream. Since, as we know, these flood events don't necessarily affect one city at a time, it affects the Quad Cities as a whole. And so we're really trying to emulate that approach through this planning framework.
That's really cool, and that's really helpful to hear about as somebody who doesn't know too much about the science and all the data that goes into this. It's really cool to hear how these areas are identified for conservation and for the most potential returns. And so we've been discussing a little bit about hazard mitigation plans as one of the local planning documents into which these kinds of tools could be incorporated. And so I'm curious to hear how hazard mitigation plans can be used to support wetland protection and other nature-based solutions.
Yeah, at the most basic level, hazard mitigation plans are opportunities for a community to proactively prepare for disasters by identifying local risks and ways to reduce them. In FEMA's world, the Federal Emergency Management Agency's world, the primary outcome is to protect life and property. The corridor that we have developed, that one of the outcomes is protecting people and tax dollars from these very costly natural hazards by using and leveraging these natural areas like wetlands and floodplains that are already managing stormwater and excess floodwater. So you can see the strong alignment between the outcomes from both the hazard mitigation planning process and the work that we've done to map the ecological corridor. But right now, about 20% of the mapped corridor is protected, which means most of the land that naturally helps manage for flooding in the Quad Cities is vulnerable to development or other land use changes. And we are exploring how hazard mitigation plans can be a tool to build this corridor network and really expand it. There's a great example in northern Wisconsin in Ashland County of a community that has experienced pretty significant flooding and as a result of wetland loss from land use changes. And about a decade ago, the community really pivoted as a result of these significant floods to using wetlands as natural flood management tools. And that included an addendum to their local hazard mitigation plan that explored these natural flood management strategies, including wetland restoration. And what's really interesting is the work that happened at that county level really helped develop a state grant program that now funds pre-disaster flood resilience practices across the state. I do want to caveat all of this that hazard mitigation plans, like any other plan, are only as good as the information that they're built on, the people who are involved and committed to executing them, and the funding that's secured to implement them. So while there are these tools that we can leverage and explore, it's also really important to have those three major considerations as well.
And to kind of ground us a little bit in an example from the Quad Cities region itself, maybe we can talk about how in July 2025, the Rock Island City Council approved the resolution to protect more than 600 acres of wetlands. What motivated that decision and what did it take to get there? More so, can you explain how the conservation easement works in practice and why it was the right tool in this case?
I'll give you the cliff notes of this. It's a pretty incredible story that is pretty in depth. But in terms of relation to our connection and our work, after we released the assessment in 2024, we continue to do outreach to our previously engaged stakeholders, new stakeholders, and part of that included outreach to city municipalities. And through these conversations, it revealed that the city of Rock Island had an interest in developing an urban wetland complex for both environmental and economic benefits. So we had several conversations in that space, but unfortunately our progress really stalled because of a lack of funding. The city at the time needed to have a wetland management plan in order to move forward, but lacked the financial resources to do so. And so we continued scoping and looking at potential options to move this forward. And during this time, a proposed development came into play on about 10 acres that sits adjacent to the wetlands. And this really sparked a strong community advocacy for protection of the surrounding wetlands. And so, in response to that community advocacy, the city of Rock Island formed a task force to assist the city in securing a conservation easement and develop a wetland management plan for these 550 acres of wetlands. Where we are right now, I currently chair the task force, and we're a little over a year into the process. But right now, we're slated for a designation or protection for January of 2027, and really continue to work to bring in different ecological and community engagement partners to help with the development of this proposal and management plan. And so I know you mentioned the conservation easement, how it works in this particular instance and why it was the right option for the city, which was something we took some time to really deliberate on and is part of the task force's duties to kind of help provide that advisory role to the city council. And after providing a couple of different options, the task force recommended that the city move forward with a land and water reserve designation. And this is done in collaboration with the Illinois Nature Preserves Commission, INPC. And this is a voluntary, legally binding agreement to protect the site as part of Illinois' natural heritage. And there's several reasons why the city decided that this was in their best interest to move forward, because the INPC partnership really provides a few key benefits. One of which is that legally binding governance. So this provides a management agreement that prevents unilateral city decisions that could harm the wetlands, not only now, but in the future, which is really important when city leadership can change at any point in time and will change subsequently in the future. Additionally, that will move with whoever ends up having the land. So for instance, if the city decides in the future that there's another partner who is maybe more capable of taking on the management of this area from both a stewardship and financial aspect, that transfer can happen and that protection remains in place. Second is technical support. The city of Rock Island doesn't really have a lot of support in labor and financial resources as it pertains to invasive species control or habitat restoration, ecological monitoring. And so this partnership with INPC allows for, minimal annual support in those areas to really help ensure that this area not only survives, but thrives throughout the years. And then finally is funding access. So there is a benefit in terms of state funding, not only to help in assistance with the wetland management plan and proposal, but once this area is designated as a land and water reserve, it opens up opportunities for grant funding, not only at the state, but potentially the local and even at the federal level in the future as well. So there were a lot of working parts that ultimately came together that really provided the city of Rock Island with the most security in moving forward with this option for permanent protection.
Thank you, Nina. And you hinted at what I wanted to ask you both about next. A lot of municipalities will face that difficulty of funding when it comes to wanting to take some more ambitious steps to conserve or protect wetlands, right? And so when it comes to implementation, I know we've touched on this a little bit, but on a broader scale beyond Rock Island, where does the funding typically come from and what financing tools or mechanisms are most effective for these kinds of projects?
So historically, we've seen the most substantial funding come from federal programs. Some are tied to post-disaster declarations, either through the Federal Emergency Management Agency or Housing and Urban Development. But pre-disaster, there are still federal opportunities that fund nature-based projects, but that landscape is currently a little murky, to say it pretty lightly. There are still federal opportunities out there, and NWF does track and catalog those in a searchable database. We have a funding database that focuses on federal programs, and you can find that at funding nature-based solutions, which is all one word, .nwf.org. There are also a limited amount of non-federal grants that support nature-based projects, but those tend to be a little more limited and really depend on what region of the country you live in. As for more private or other financing options, there are examples like green banks. The state of Connecticut has a green bank. It was originally developed for financing clean energy projects, but it's since then expanded to include climate resiliency and adaptation projects. There are also state programs like the one in Ohio that takes advantage of revolving loan funds. So they have a decades-old sponsorship program in Ohio that is funded through the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. And essentially what this does is it allows a utility to, quote, sponsor a conservation project in addition to a infrastructure project that they might have typically applied for Clean Water State Revolving Fund loan for. And in exchange for sponsoring a project, a utility will receive a reduced interest rate on their loan. And over the course of this loan, that reduced interest rate will offset the cost of that sponsored project. There are also local examples of counties and cities that can use different financing mechanisms. In Iowa, there was a bill in the state legislature that didn't pass, but if it did, it would have allowed counties to issue bonds that would fund natural flood mitigation practices like wetland restoration. There are also examples of counties that are exploring more specialized insurance policies. So if a policy is triggered, then that would provide a payout that could be used for restoration or enhancing nature. So what is most effective is really hard to say that there is like one mechanism or one approach that's going to do it all anywhere and everywhere in the country. And currently we don't have that. There's really no silver bullet. And sometimes there isn't even a template for like how you go about securing that funding. But we do know that there are key ingredients that you need in place. Partnerships is one. It's very important, especially local partnerships. Knowing where to implement your practices for the highest impact. So having some scientific analysis or data. Staffing is also really important, not just having technical assistance, but also someone to coordinate or manage your grants and projects. And then finally, it is important to have a plan. And typically it's better to have a plan and no money versus money and no plan. You really want to know what you're doing and where and why, and be really strategic about it. The last thing I'll say about this is that these kinds of investments for infrastructure and the environment can often be overshadowed by other immediate needs that local governments need to respond to, like the economy or public health. So being able to quantify and link nature-based practices to these other critical outcomes, like the number of lives saved or the costs avoided, can really help guide capital investments and other financing.
I think that will hopefully be a helpful briefing on some of these financing aspects for anyone who is listening who's maybe part of their local municipality staff or even just an interested community member who might be willing to bring some of these ideas to their local government bodies. Thank you both so much for joining me today. It's been a pleasure having you on the episode.
Thanks for having us. Good to be here.
And that's a wrap on today's episode. From the legal underpinnings of Post-Sackett local wetland governance, to Bluffton's first in South Carolina wetland ordinance, to the Quad Cities Ecological Corridor and a landmark conservation win, this conversation is a testament to what's possible when communities, NGOs, and local governments decide to lead. If anything you heard today sparked ideas for your own community, your next step should be downloading ELI's local wetland protection playbook. It's a free, practical resource that lays out a menu of local strategies, regulatory and non-regulatory, that communities can use to protect wetlands at the local level. We'll drop a link in the show notes. And with May being American Wetlands Month, there's no better time to share this resource with your network, because awareness is the first step toward action. So if this episode resonated with you, I'd encourage you to share it with your network. While you're at it, hit subscribe so you never miss an episode of People, Places, Planet. Until next time.
Thanks for listening to People, Places, Planet, the official podcast of the Environmental Law Institute. Our work wouldn't be possible without the support of people like you. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, attend one of our events, or support our work financially, head to eli.org.